Welcome to the Practical Spirituality series. The purpose of this series is to share what I have read and learned about how your spirituality can function in everyday life. I like to call it practical spirituality. My goal is to give you some ideas on things like how to acknowledge conflicts and deal with them, how to let negative thoughts wash off of you, and how we attract the right people to associate with. I'm going to review systems that are used for this purpose as well as individual practices. I hope these insights prove beneficial to you and your family. This is all going to come to some place, but what I wanted to do is kind of capture every place that if you will, I've been to get here. So I started off telling you about, systems in spirituality and why that was important for me. And it came around the story, again, of the one young woman who came to Redondo to return some things while she was in a 12-step process. And she remember that she had been working for the rector who was before me, who was pretty dysfunctional, and she identified him as dad. And that was the first point for me of, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on out there. And from there, I started looking into systems theory some more. And that also came up at a time when I'd done a premarital survey, and the same thing. They could in this survey take 10 questions and tell you basically what your family, for the most part, looked like in terms of what the rules were. And again, that all came out of, remember, Adolf Hitler. And the whole point of Hitler was that, again, sociologists went back and tried to figure out how could this whole country that was, God-fearing people rally around and be a part of something so evil. And the whole point was that a lot of it was about family systems. And that great story of Eichmann, which is a terrible story, but also just so fitting that he was more disappointed in himself, not to hear the stories of the atrocities he committed, but the fact that when the judge entered the room, he did not stand up. And it was that sense of obedience that made him, that he was more insulted and ashamed about that than he was about the things he'd done. And that's just how powerful systems can be. And so for me, it's why would we start there? A couple things, several points on what this has to do with spirituality. The first is that when you begin to understand systems and just how they work and live into them, it gives you permission, especially when you're in leadership spots or spots where people are looking to you, it gives you permission not to personalize others' behavior. In other words, oftentimes we can do is take things personally and understand this person is reacting to us. And if you understand some of this, it doesn't have to be that way. In other words, people could be reacting to all kinds of different things, and the important thing is to be able to stay in situations and not over-personalize. And systems will help you with that. Secondly, when we're unhealthy, we're going to attract unhealthy people. Just a sense of, Bradshaw talks about that, and Friedman follows up with it. This idea that you can walk into a room and we just attract people who just seem to fit us in that way. And Friedman, the same thing, talks about this idea of what you're putting out is who you will attract. And the opposite is true. When we're in a healthy space, more healthy people tend to gather around us. And then finally, Friedman's whole point of the power of one. You remember I had the mobile up here last week, and Bradshaw did such a great job of taking a family mobile and showing how when one person's dysfunctional, the whole mobile has to move around. Friedman was the one who really intervenes and says, that is all true, but also if one person maintains sanity and is healthy, the whole system has to come back the other way. And so his contention would be if you stop that mobile and one person in the middle of a system can stay healthy, everything else has to bump into them. And so there's a great power in us being into the world, living into our lives, and just understanding that wherever we are, we have this capacity to maintain and be in touch with something beyond us, which can affect all the environment. And finally, the last one here is Friedman was really good at acknowledging there's going to be conflict. In other words, whenever we're in systems, and especially again, if you're in a leadership role, just get used to it. I had a mentor who used to say the same thing about raising kids. When you raise kids, when they're teenagers, they're going to fight. They just have to fight. And so once you get that and you acknowledge that, then you can be prepared for it and you know how to go through it. If you don't and you keep thinking there's a way to maintain peace with a young person who's trying to become an adult, it's probably not going to happen. And it's okay, it's all right, it's part of the deal. But if you acknowledge that, you know it's going to happen, you can live into it easier as compared to being surprised every time you get in these kinds of situations. So Friedman's whole point was sometimes when you begin to get healthy or you're in a healthy situation and this is the way you're behaving and the system reacts to you, that's a good sign. So it's not bad, it's part of living. So going forward, Covey then writes this book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I talked about it in the sermon today. We'll talk about it here a little bit more. But he goes through and reviews all this literature, as I talked about, going all the way back to Ben Franklin's autobiography. And the contention there in those early years is that there was a list of positive virtues, which that he wanted to cultivate. So his contention was that we all have this character within us. It's a God-given, it's been imbued by the divine, and that when we stay close to it, then that was what happens, that will translate into success. And he points out that there was a shift. There was 150 years where everyone did the same thing, it was all about character, and all of a sudden, right about post-World War II, there's this shift. And it goes out of about living into your character and who you are and more about what you project. And so the shift then comes with Dale Carnegie. He writes a famous book. And Covey says that there's a difference between a character ethic and a personality ethic. And that one is inside out and the other is outside in. And they would probably say we're still living in that era today, that this is gone unchecked, if you will. And so for all this time, there's a sense that if you want to be successful, it's really about what other people think about you and about you having a smile on your face and having lots of people around as compared to it is really staying close to who you are. And then the famous, of course, Arthur Miller's book, Death of a Salesman, becomes one that is just it's an all-time one because it really was the one that takes all this concept that's happening in culture and puts it and personifies it into one person, and that's Willy Loman, who some even say that Willy was Will He, that Loman was always didn't know whether he would or wouldn't, and that Lowman he was the lowest one in the totem pole. But this character personifies all that. Willy Loman buys into the whole idea is success is being well-liked and making money. And so he begins and spends the rest of his career trying to pursue that. He creates illusions about who he is, about who his family is, and he's trying to live into this personality ethic, if you will, and it doesn't go well for him. At the end, he dies lonely and destitute and takes his life basically to give an insurance policy to his family. And that becomes the end of this very, very tragic story. And as Aristotle says in Poetics, the great tragic hero is the combination of nobleness and a flaw, and that Loman's flaw is that he misplaces faith in success. And so all that comes about right about this same time, and it's about this era that, again, I would say we probably live in nowadays with all the social media and all the rest. And we see our children, and I'm constantly amazed at what goes on. And the fact that I was just telling Steve O'Leary this morning, lots of information coming out about how people who look at too much Facebook get depressed, because what they see in there are all these posts of everyone doing really well in life, and they assume that then their life must be messed up because it's not going as well as everybody else's is. But what we do is end up projecting what is going well and really don't share what's not going well, and why would you? But the point is, we all assume that everyone else is extremely successful, and we're not. And so we kind of still live in that culture where that is their frame of mind. Remember that for me, though, having said all that, and that's all interesting, but for me, the key to Covey's book really was this statement that between stimulus and response, there is a gap. And that was first said by Viktor Frankl, but the whole idea is that between action and reaction, there's something happens. And that's the space that if you can own that and understand that and really hold on to that, this would be one of those principles for me you just never let go of. That no matter what happens, there is always a gap. And that's just a universal metaphysical principle. In other words, that's just true. And then if you get that, then we always have a choice on how we're going to behave. And that was really, for me, what Covey did was begin to talk about that space and that how when we're living in our lives, we have this choice. What are we going to do? And so he asserts that Emotional pain, stunted relationships, all the rest can be from a lack of adherence to natural principles, which he calls character. So he goes back and says that our unhappiness is not due, as Bradshaw said, to our family system, but more about us drifting from this space called character. And true happiness then is from an inside out versus based on sound character. So it's that whole idea that Covey, for me, really introduces inside out versus outside in. So in order to be more effective, we would align ourselves with natural principles and effectiveness would follow. So he says it's impossible to break the law. We can only break ourselves against the law. And there's this great fable that sort of lines up with this called, you might know it, Aesop's fable of the golden egg. And the golden egg was a story of this farmer who one time goes out and he notices that this goose has laid this egg, and he takes it to have it examined, and the egg is all gold. And so every day the goose produces these eggs. The farmer gets very rich, but as he's going along, he basically identifies the fact that he needs more of these, and the sooner he gets them, the more effective he would be. And so what he does is he goes, of course, and he cuts the goose open to try to obtain the rest of the eggs, and there's nothing there. And so he kills the goose. Okay, a paradigm shift. Biggest part about Covey is this idea of a paradigm shift. So, as an example, how many of you see an old woman? Raise your hand. How many of you see a young woman? Raise your hand. And so if you remember this, then Covey's whole point was that they're both here. There's the old woman, there's the young woman. And so he talks about this idea, and this is where I want to get to with effectiveness, is where his book goes, is the problem. The way we see the problem is the problem. In other words, Covey makes this whole idea that it's really not about what you're experiencing, it's about how you see things. And he tells this really essential and important story about how he's in the subway one time, and this gentleman gets on, and he has these two boys, and these two boys are on the subway, and they sit down at first, and they begin to crawl all over each other, and then they begin to crawl over other people on the subway. And so what happens is that Covey takes it upon himself to go say something to this man. He says, I don't know if you notice this, sir, but your children are disturbing everybody in the subway. And the gentleman says, oh, I'm so sorry. He said, I've just come back from the emergency room, and my wife, their mother, has died tragically and suddenly. And so Covey's point is he goes from being pretty judgmental about this man to having this shift, just like that. And it wasn't that the situation had changed, it's that his view of the situation had changed. He received some new information. So his whole contention was that then every situation we encounter, it really comes back to us in terms of how we see things, not what really happening. Because in that situation there, the kids' behavior did not change. They were still crawling all over people. But once people heard that in the subway, they gave this man a berth, and they realized that they needed to be helpful as compared to be judgmental. So Covey was the one who really begins to make this mind-altering, and really it just changes the whole course of spirituality, if you will, because it goes back to this idea of being on the inside versus being on the outside. And he calls that the paradigm shift. So now we're transitioning from Covey into this next level, which is Daniel Goleman's. And Goleman begins to do this work on the brain. And the whole point of the brain was that when we're in a good space and when we're in and we're a sense of well-being, we have access to all kinds of creativity. And when we're not in a good space or we have anxiety, that gets shut down. And we go back to this place called the amygdala, which is a very much, if you will, a lizard brain. And the lizard brain basically gets cut off from creativity, cut off from the bigger picture. It's going to be a flight or fight response. And so the point is, in the first part is that average person, 70,000 thoughts come through your brain every day. So that means from the time, if you were married, from the time that you leave and your spouse goes off one way and you go off the other way, that each of you are going to have 70,000 thoughts before if you will, you come back together, or maybe 50,000. But the point is, you're going to go off in two different directions. And if you think about it, it's almost a miracle that anyone can stay married when you're having that many ideas coming through all the time and going in that many different directions and are somehow able to come home. But the point of those thoughts partially is that, if again, that's 48 thoughts per minute. So while we're sitting here, 48 thoughts per minute going through your mind, and your brain is constantly then trying to figure out which ones it's going to choose and which ones it's not going to choose. And so that the equivalent of blood flowing through your brain would be 3 full cans of soda each minute. That's how much the brain takes to basically work, is it constantly having to have oxygen and all the rest. And that here's the key to Goldman's study, is that the emotional brain responds to an event more quickly than the thinking brain. So we're going to have this sense of emotion first, and then the thinking brain is the one that comes back. So being able to slow that down or get a sense of biting your tongue, if you will, was all part of that idea of just what do you do to stop? And again, go back to the gap between stimulus and response. So Goldman also says there's zero correlation between IQ and emotional empathy. There are two different parts of the brain. So he was the one who basically separates the two and says there's this emotional part and there's this IQ part, and that they're different. And that basically, and there was a great article in the New York Times that just appeared over the weekend, this whole idea that mindfulness, anything that we do to slow things down, that we can actually change circuitry in the brain. So as we begin to, if you have a lot of things that are going on, and there's a lot of distractions, and we can stop everything for a moment and just focus on one thing, that as we do that, those circuits get better. And they will, and so therefore you can train your brain actually to become more, if you will, emotionally intelligent. And he would go further and says that for adults, 80% of success comes from emotional intelligence. In other words, it's the capacity to just take a deep breath and to slow things down, and that we've let our emotions get out of control and we listen to our anxiety instead of this other place that's always within us where we get ourselves in trouble. And so his contention is, up to this point, it was all about IQ, and Goldman changes the whole paradigm. And again, he was further much says the same thing that both Friedman and Pransky said, and that is emotions are contagious. That if you come from a place where there's a lot of joy in the room, you're going to take that joy with you. If you come to a place where there's a lot of negativity in the room, you're apt to take that negativity with you. So again, it goes back to just being aware of your surroundings and understanding that that is always the case, that it's almost like this virus that you can take or pass off to people. Goldman tells us this another great story. Again, for me, it was another one of these just cutting-edge stories about a flight attendant. And the story goes that it's Super Bowl Sunday. A lot of business people are on this jet. They all want to see the Super Bowl. 2-hour delay. So everyone's getting pretty anxious about this. They're trying to get home, all the rest. And then after all this 2-hour delay, the flight gets into the airport, and there's for some reason, the gate doesn't open. And all these people are standing up, and they're getting pretty agitated. And so the attendant comes out, and what she's supposed to say is FAA regulations state that everyone needs to sit down. But instead she says, everybody is standing. And everyone starts laughing, and they sit down, and they understand what they've done. And when they get off the plane, they have a great mood. And that was, for him, that was this great story of emotional intelligence. She saw a situation, she could have gone ahead and done the first thing, which would have been this very cognitive kind of response. Instead, she takes a step back, goes a different route, and changes the whole atmosphere. And they said that people got off the plane, they're laughing, and everyone's wondering, well, how could these people be so happy? It was all because of that one statement where she's able to look around the room and take a different course. And so again, this is all about this empowerment of us as individuals, that each and every one of us has this capacity, if we're able to slow things down a bit and not, if you will, take the first of the 70,000 thoughts that might come through our brain, but to find that higher, that better idea, that we can be more effective in daily life. So why paradigm shifts in EQ for spirituality this time around? Again, the gap between stimulus and response. For me, that was the huge thing that Covey does. It's a game changer. If you hold on to that, every day just begin to practice that idea that you have this choice, that you can go ahead and you understand that new thoughts are going to come up. So in any situation, just to listen to yourself and take a step back and understand that when an idea comes up, Maybe it's not the first pass, maybe it's not the second pass, maybe wait for the third. But just like if the 70,000 thoughts come up, we've talked about it before, but it'd be sort of like when you're driving down the road and you see all kinds of signs coming at you. Which one do you choose to listen at? And the whole point of Goleman's thing is that if you don't like the first idea, wait for the second, or wait for the third, or wait till you settle down. That one's going to come along that's going to be good. But we have that choice on which one we're going to pick. Again, EQ can be learned, so this is not something that you're born with. IQ you're born with. EQ, Goleman said that you can continue to foster it, and you can get better at it. And again, people tend to become more emotionally intelligent as they age. So just a natural case. The more we've been through, the more chances we have to go, I've been here before. It doesn't have to go that way. That is a reality of emotional intelligence. And again, there abides within us. They're getting closer now to there abides within us an innate wisdom. Covey calls it character. By the time where we are today, we would say it's much further than that in terms of spirituality. But he was the one who really changed the course of this conversation, because up to that, basically Bradshaw's contention in terms of systems was that we're damaged, but he doesn't really go very far in terms of there's an innate wisdom within us. Covey's the one that comes along and says there's something abiding in us. He called it character, but we're going to go further in that in the next 2 weeks. But contention being that there's something here that's always here, and that is provable, and that works. And then finally, again, the way that we see things determines what we see. It's the way we see things. In other words, how you're looking at something is much more important than what you're looking at. And that, again, quantum physics would tell us the same thing, but this idea that we're moving towards, in terms of this literature, how you see things, again, is going to have all the impact. And so there are different interpretations to the same event. And you know where you see this a lot, I would say this in daily life, is in emails. How many times have you looked at an email where the person has just become kind of, if you will, maybe a neutral, matter-of-fact statement, but you can read that as negative, and then you talk to the person later and they say, oh no, I was just kind of saying the sky is blue, but you take it in a different manner, because again, where we are determines, if you will, what we see. And that was where Goleman was coming from with his book, and again, sets the stage for this next level.